In episode 61 of Mobycast, we recap another DockerCon 2019 session titled, Just What is a Server Mesh? And If I Get One, Will It Make Everything Okay? By Elton Stoneman. Welcome to Mobycast, a weekly conversation about cloud-native development, AWS, and building distributed systems. Let's jump right in.
Welcome, Chris. It's another episode of Mobycast.
Hey, John. Good to be back.
All right. 2 in a row where we're missing Rich. It's a little tough, but I'll ask you what you've been up to lately, Chris.
I have been enjoying the weather here in Seattle. So it's sunny. I think it's going to hit almost 80 degrees today. And so I've been getting a lot of outside time, making up for our incredibly long winter. So this is just so joyful. Seeing the sun, feeling the heat, wearing shorts, getting some miles in on my bike, and trying not to look at the forecast that's coming for next week, where like this is getting taken away.
That's what happened to us this week.
Yeah,
it's awful here, and it's supposed to be the start of river surfing season. And if you don't know what that is, Google will help you. Just Google river surfing, and I was excited for it, and now the flows are all down because flows of river water on melt season go down when it gets cold, and so they don't create a nice big wave to surf on.
No, you need like a flamethrower or something like that, right?
Right.
Get a few of those.
Melt all the mountains.
Yes, stations and people above, and just get to work.
So we're going to do another episode talking about one of the other really good talks that you saw at DockerCon, and this will probably be a 2-parter as well. And as we said, that DockerCon this year was really more focused on the enterprise and also likely on people that are kind of new to Docker. So a lot of the talks that were available were not for people that have been using Docker since its inception. But this one, I think for me, I'm really excited about it. We're going to talk about service meshes, which I've known only just enough about until today, until an hour, half an hour from now. I've only known just enough about to figure that we're probably fine without them for our clients and within our company at Kelsus. But I hope to be proven wrong. Maybe it's time. Maybe they've kind of become something that even users of like 4 and 5 and a dozen microservices could benefit from a service mesh. So let's get into it, Chris. Let's talk about service meshes.
Yeah. So this was, I think, it's a good time to talk about it just because the term service mesh has been out there now for a while. It's pretty hot, buzzword, if you will. You hear a lot of talk about it, and definitely in relation to like the most popular service mesh right now, which is Istio. And so when I saw this talk there at DockerCon, it's like, this makes sense to go sit through it and see what they have to say. And so the title of the session was Just What is a Service Mesh? And If I Get One, Will It Make Everything Okay? And this was given by Elton Stoneman, who's a developer advocate at Docker. And what was really good about this session is that it just really talk about kind of like in a general high level, like service mesh. And so things we'll kind of cover is, what is a service mesh and why do we need them? And how do they work? Like, what's the basic architecture and what functionality do you get with them? And should you use one? And, what's the cost of doing this? So that's what we'll talk about today. So some just really, give a good treatment to service mesh. And then by the end of this, definitely should have a good idea of that question you had at the top of, hey, should we be using this for our clients? Yep. I think the answer will be very evident after we go through this. So with that, service mesh defined, so what is this? And so Elton kind of had his own simplified definition of it, and he likes to refer to it as it's the communication between software components made into its own thing.
Okay.
Right. So note, it's not container specific. It's not microservice specific. Really, it's just kind of referring to this communication backbone, if you will, for these components to be able to talk to each other.
I mean, the old curmudgeon in me says that we used to call that middleware, but okay.
Sure. There's been just anything and everything under the sun and various different technologies and things. We used to have, I don't know if do you remember like Corba?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I'm getting at.
right?
Yeah, you've got
Orbs,
your
object
billing
requests.
system and your ordering system, and they all need to talk to each other. And you put some middleware into the enterprise, and that handles all that communication. Yeah.
I think the difference here is that most of those things weren't necessarily doing network traffic and trying to like basically. I think you can kind of think of a service mesh as the switchboard.
Okay.
Right. So like the telephone operator that's connecting calls, right? So someone tries to make a call and says, I want to go talk to this person. So the operator's like making that connection, right? The person calling doesn't know how that connection needs to be made. They're just requesting that it be made. And then it's up to the operator they have the map, right? If you will, of how to talk to them. And so that's kind of what a service mesh is doing versus the things like the object request brokers and that middleware. I think that was more about just interoperability and marshaling, unmarshaling, type thing. So it was more at the application level layer than it was at the networking layer. And that's really where the service mesh lies.
Okay. So that description, I want to poke on this a little bit more. And I know we're going to get deeper into what it actually is and what it does, but it's making me feel like service meshes are kind of like DNS, but up a level, like DNS for your services.
It's a big part of it, right? So like you can't really talk about service mesh without talking about service discovery. So, that's a whole big topic. And that's definitely part of, one of the things that a service mesh will give you. So service discovery is basically DNS at for microservices, right? Where you have, many, many microservices and kind of keeping track of just what the names are and where they live, it becomes a difficult problem. So service discovery is kind of like pushing more to making that much more dynamic. And that's definitely something that service mesh will help facilitate.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. That helps.
Yeah. So, so now we have kind of like this kind of broad general definition of service mesh. It's like, well, why do we need a service mesh? Right. And so during this talk, kind of like walk through the examples, like, okay, let's start with just a simple application. We have a web server and it needs to talk to a database. Right. And so in order to do that, you need to either know or you need to implement functionality for like things like, well, what's the address of the database server? How do I connect to it? What are timeouts and how does that work? What about retry logic? What about encryption? Right. So all that needs to be thought of and needs to be implemented and dealt with. And that's if you just have two components, then okay, you just do it once and you're done. But now what happens when you add an API server into the mix? So you have the web server, an API server, and a database server. And so now you have to start doing the same things again, right? So those connections between, say, the web server and the API server, same kind of issues. Like, what's the address? How do I connect to it? I have to do retry logic. What about encryption, timeouts, and whatnot? So, with a microservices architecture like this could definitely very quickly become an unmanageable task where you have so many point-to-point connections, right? Because there's so many different software components in there and services, and you have all these different point-to-point connections that can be made, and you have to deal with all these kind of communication things, right? And so
I'm sort of with you, but I've got to interrupt again, and I apologize, but so this is where my mind is going. It's like, okay, you just put an apple and an orange and a banana out, and you said they all talk to each other the same way, so let's abstract that out. But I'm kind of like, no, they don't. They're apple and orange and banana, and I will have very different rules on retrying to a database than I will, maybe a web server asking my API server. That's maybe fine if it retries in a certain way. But I'm certainly not going to, retry in certain ways, the same way against my database. I don't know. It just feels very, and then like the communication between them is different too. Like the database, I guess under it all, it's TCP/IP, but like there's a reason that we're not just writing socket code between our API server and our database, and that all, it's all been raised up a level. So I don't know. I'm nervous because it feels like we're going to have a bag full of really disparate stuff, and we're going to try to make it interoperable or try to find the lowest common denominator between all of it. And it's not going to be that useful.
Yeah. So, I mean, a few things to keep in mind. So I guess same with the fruit analogy, in this particular case, I did mention three components that are quite different in functionality, right? So front-end web server, microservice, API in the middle, and a database server. So call it, apple, banana, pear, or whatever it is, right? However, in a microservices architecture, you're going to have lots and lots of API servers, right? And So they're all bananas, right? There might be slightly different ones, like different varieties or whatnot. And the same thing with the apples, right? You're going to have a lot of different apples. Some cameos, some gala apples and whatnot, right? So you have that. So think of it from that respect, is that you definitely have categories of things. And so you can think about like just at a high level, like you could probably like, okay, yeah, retry logic might be different when I'm talking to a database, but maybe not so much different when it's talking to a RESTful API, type thing, right? So I can have like service policies that apply to each type of fruit, if you will. And then, further extending that, like at the end of the day, all these things need things like water, fertilizer, sunlight, right? And that's regardless of what kind of fruit it is, right?
Okay.
So there's a lot, again, there's a lot of commonality there. There's a lot of duplication. There's things that you can kind of like categorize and group together as well. So lots of overlap. And that's what a service mesh is addressing, right? Is so that you don't have to keep reinventing the wheel and keep your architecture dry.
Okay, cool.
Right. So that's basically the genesis for why service meshes were created, right? Is really kind of, it does boil down to like microservices architecture and the proliferation of many individual components instead of big monoliths. And so the point-to-point communications goes up, and so this becomes much more of an issue. So this is a good time maybe to talk about like just how, in general, like how a service mesh works, the basic architecture, and really, I mean, the key point here is that it's a proxy to the software component. So like just about every service mesh works this way, where they're gonna, for each component that you have that you want to be part of the mesh, there's going to be a sidecar deployment of a proxy. And that proxy is what basically gives it access to the mesh. And now, instead of your software component talking directly to other software components, the only thing it talks to is its proxy. And it's the proxies that are now implementing this whole communication backbone type thing.
Okay. Yeah.
Right? So you
basically, you're not doing some of this stuff like encryption and maybe even authentication too, like stuff like that. Is that going to all reside now in these sidecars that you put everywhere?
It depends on how what mesh you're using and how much of those features that you are doing. It depends on your application. It depends on what we mean by that. Like if it's mutual TLS encryption, right? Like the certificates and identities, that can definitely be managed by your mesh, right? And it will. Okay. So I think so that's definitely something key, going forward.
Yeah, that helps it become clear now that I have like a single, one understandable thing that gets attached to every single container in my system that I can go talk to, and that container is responsible for getting information in and out of that actual running container. That I get it. I can see how that could be useful.
Yes. So your software components, they talk to the proxy, and then the proxy talks to the other proxies. Right. That's the community. So things like addressing, like what's the address of this thing I need to talk to, things like timeouts, retries, encryption, that all now lies in the service mesh and is implemented by the proxy.
Okay.
Right. And not only that, but now because of that architecture, and now you have that proxy that's separate from your application. It gives you you can continue to add features to it, right? So things like rate limiting becomes very easy to do and add into this. You don't have to have any changes to your application whatsoever, right? You can just have a policy that just says, hey, when this component makes a request to this other component, like I'm not going to let it do it more frequently than every 60 a second or something like that.
Cool.
So what general features does a service mesh give us? And they really kind of boil down into three broad categories. So we have traffic management. And so traffic management, this is a lot of what we've kind of already talked about. So this is like service discovery. It's things like load balancing, failure handling, health checks, retry logic. It's also customized routing, things like fault injection. You can do things like A/B testing and stage rollouts. All that falls under traffic management, and that's one of the big things that a service mesh will give you. A second large component of a service mesh is the security. So things like encryption, authentication, authorization, all that can be covered with your service mesh, which things like having mutual TLS encryption and certificate management, which is completely automated, right? So your mesh can issue, can keep track, and also rotate the certificates that are being used to do that mutual TLS.
So now it's becoming just so obvious to me, and I think that for a lot of people that are new to this, but that have been around monoliths, it's like the stuff that monoliths provide for free, like your Rails framework or your Django framework is going to give you all this stuff, and then you just have to implement features on top of it. Now that everything is distributed and very small, like you still need all those features, like you still need all of the stuff that your big monolithic framework got you, but now you need it in a really distributed way. It feels like that's a big part of what service meshes give you back in this hugely distributed world.
Yeah, maybe. I think part of that too is just the fact that things like microservices architecture have now created these problems.
Mm-hmm, that's
right?
it, for sure.
So if it's a monolith and it's just talking to a database, then a lot of these issues go away. Like the idea of creating X509 certs to do encrypted mutual TLS encryption over the wire and to do auto rotation of those credentials. That's not so much of a deal. Load balancing and customized routing, these become new issues that we have to deal with because we have a microservices architecture.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, communication is much more complicated with the microservices architecture than it is with the monolith,
mm-hmm.
right? So service meshes are trying to help alleviate some of that pain.
Okay.
Hey there, this is Rich. Please pardon this quick interruption. We recently passed an internal milestone of 30,000 listens, and I wanted to take a moment to thank you for the support. I was also hoping to encourage you to head on over to iTunes to leave us a review. Positive feedback and constructive criticism are both incredibly important to us. So give us an idea of how we're doing, and we'll promise to keep publishing new episodes every week. Okay, let's dive back in.
And then the third major category of service mesh features that you can expect is observability, right? So this is things like monitoring, logging, distributed tracing, and then visualization of all this, right? Your mesh can give you that.
Okay.
So you can see all the communication that's happening inside your system, and where things might be slow or having problems, troubleshooting and debugging. If you want to, distributed tracing becomes a key problem to solve, right, in a microservices architecture, right? So it's because it's no longer just I came into the service and what happened, and said, no, you got to kind of follow thread the path, right? Because it actually went from service A to B to C to D.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to kind of take all of that into account. And so that's distributed tracing. And so that's something your service mesh will give you as well.
Okay, cool. I feel like I get that. And I also feel like I already have an inkling of where this is going and whether we need this or not. And it feels like my preview of where it's going, it's what is a harder problem for you right now? Dealing with all of your services and all of the things that they need in terms of care and feeding to operate them, and for them to communicate with one another. Is that harder for you?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, it just boils down to how much pain do you have with this communication between your microservices, right? And if you have enough microservices where it's painful, then you need a mesh. But if you really aren't feeling the pain, and these features that we're calling out are not really speaking to you, then you probably don't need it. There's
right. I guess that's what I was getting at, is you don't need it if you're just deploying a few services and you don't deploy, maybe you're not deploying them more than a couple times a week at most, and you have good CI/CD that deploys them automatically, and then it's not hard for them to find each other because there's only a few of them, and it's not difficult. You don't have, they all have their own rules for retry and failure, and monitoring them is not that hard because you can just hook them each up to a monitoring system, some sort of application monitoring system, and see them all in one dashboard at one time. Then it feels like a service mesh is just adding another thing that you have to do care and feeding of. It's another component that you have to watch out for and make sure it's running, and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's
because it is an application, right? You have to deploy it into your cluster, make sure that it is got enough bandwidth to take requests. That initial proxy, it has to be up and running. Otherwise, every one of your services are all down, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, service mesh is not free. It's its own layer of complication. For an example, Istio, which we referred to a little bit earlier, it's probably the most popular and most robust or most mature service mesh out there. Just doing like a standard installation of Istio on a Kubernetes cluster ends up, during this talk, kind of pointed this out during the demo, it spins up 59 containers for just Istio, right? For just the service mesh. That's before you start even deploying any of your apps. So
that's amazing. That's amazing.
I mean, there's a lot of, and no, I mean, the other thing pointed out too is that Istio actually is right around 2 million lines of code, right?
Whoa.
So, I mean, there's a lot there. There's a lot of functionality that you're getting. But it's not free, right? I mean, there is, and not just that, but there's also, you have to think about like, well, how do I use this? How do I maintain it? How do I configure it? How do I run it? Like all that stuff. There's a learning curve to that, right? And so we're kind of getting into a little bit about, okay, like when should you use a service mesh? And then also like definitely consider the cost of the mesh. And so kind of touched a little bit about like when you should use it. So if you've got a lot of services where again, like this is causing pain, things like service discovery is a problem, things like you do want to do things like rate limiting, or you want to do more detailed fine-grained routing, or you want to make it easier to set policies for like just security reasons, like only like these services going to talk to these other services type thing. Then that's when you want to start thinking about a service mesh. Or if you have Snowflake implementations where you're finding that you're doing lather, rinse, repeat on building some of this functionality for each one of your apps or microservices, then that's another one of those things that should spur you to look at a service mesh as a way of getting out of that reinventing of the wheel. And then you also might consider a service mesh if you're doing an application pilot from scratch. So greenfield, building like a cloud native application, you might consider just as a way of piloting it, right? And kind of getting some familiarity with the service mesh. But if you have a handful of microservices, probably don't need a service mesh.
Yeah, I don't know if I may just have to do a hard disagree there. Like, unless you're sure that you're gonna, go from 0 to 60 very, very quickly, it sure feels like I don't know, spending a limited development budget playing with a service mesh as you're also trying to invent something brand new. It feels a little wrong-headed to me. Don't use that as the time to, go do something else that's also super hard in addition to developing a brand new application that's never existed before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the point that Elton was making here was just like, if you're going to use it, like don't do it on an existing application that's where you have to go and change code and whatnot, right? Like do it with something that's starting from scratch. And so if you want to, I mean,
it's really hard. It's really like a very tricky problem then, because it's like when you start from scratch, unless you know right out of the gate that like, okay, we're going to start from scratch and this thing is going to have 25 microservices that all need to talk to each other and it's going to have millions of users and blah, blah, blah. Like, that from day one, and like, that you're going to need that kind of load balancing capability and that kind of like super, super flexible, route management and all the things that you get from a service mesh. If you know that, maybe you're a telco and you're building a new thing, so you're already, that's what's going to happen as soon as you open the door. People are going to flood in, and it's like you need that. Okay, sure, that's probably when to do it. But otherwise, if you're like, we don't know if people are going to use this or not, and we're not sure if this is going to be a big thing. Maybe you're a startup, or you're building a new thing within an enterprise, and you don't know how people are going to react to it, and it'll start small. Then it feels like you shouldn't start with it, right? You should leave it out in order to maximize the amount of features you can get per developer hour. But then you end up in a situation later where you need it, and it seems like the most important feature that Istio developers out there could think about as they're developing and adding features to this is like, people need to be able to add this to existing architectures. People let's think really hard about that, because it's architectures that grow that are the ones that suffer from, service tanglement that makes you want to have a service mesh. Like, doesn't it seem like that would be the case? Like, crap, everything's falling over. We have service tanglement. We don't know what to do. I've heard Istio solves this problem. Let's go at it. Like, wouldn't that be the most normal way into it?
Yeah, but it's kind of like just with everything else, it's like the architecture is baked in. So this is architecture change. So there's no silver bullet, right? It's the same kind of issue we've been dealing with over the last 5, 6, 7 years of big balls of mud, monolith, decomposing them into microservices. Like, how do you do that while just not grinding everything to a halt? And so it's the same thing here.
I guess, I mean, I just want to push on this some more because it doesn't feel like it should be the same thing, because like you've already got microservices. You decided at the beginning you're going to do microservices. And the nice thing about microservices is that they are all, independently deployable and kind of have the same surface area from the outside. At least they all look like little black boxes that are running, in containers, and each have their own little cluster maybe, but for the most part, they're not like proteins. They don't have like, they're pretty similar looking. So it seems like it should, like, the whole point is that it should be possible to take those things and then put them into a management system that just proxies them. And then they're like, hey, I'm still cool. You're proxying to me, like, no problem, cool. I was fine without being proxied to, and I'm still fine now that you're proxying to me. Like, doesn't it? I don't know. I've never.
The level of effort that's going to take is going to be directly commensurate with like what you've put into your application to begin with, right? So like things like, all these things that the service mesh gives you, like service discovery and mutual TLS, retry logic, routing. So it just really depends on your existing architecture, how you're dealing with that. If you are, and you now have code changes to change. Even something just as simple as just service discovery, like maybe now you're using DNS and now you need to change. So that's code change right there.
Yeah.
Maybe you've implemented TLS encryption between you and other microservices, but now you want to take advantage of mutual TLS and have your service mesh to your certificates. Well, that's code change. Same thing goes with maybe you've done quotas or rate limiting, retry logic. All that. So it just really depends on.
Really disheartening problem though, because now every single time we start a new project, we're going to play a game of Russian roulette. Are we going to kill the project because we lost all of our velocity from having to implement a service mesh from day one? Or are we going to get a bunch of velocity, get a bunch of users, and then fall over when we can't apply a service mesh when we desperately need it? It's like choose which death you would rather have.
I think at the end of the good news here is that, like, people that need service mesh are Netflix, right? It's kind of like at that scale. For most people, most organizations, I just don't see them getting complicated enough where it's like, oh, if we don't have a service mesh, we're going to fail. You can implement bits and pieces of this without a mesh, right? There are service mesh alternatives. So, we talked about the three main things that's giving you traffic management, security, observability. There are mediations for all that stuff outside of a service mesh, and you can take off as little or as much of that as you want. So you can do things like feature toggles, or you can have, dynamic DNS for traffic management. We heavily use load balancers with, path-based routing in application load balancers with AWS. Mm-hmm. So we can easily do things like A/B testing if we want, or blue-green deployments. Same thing goes, same kind of things go with like observability, right? You can go implement tool. You can go do things like use hosted services like Datadog or SignalFX, or there's just millions of those kinds of those services out there. There's good open source tools in this area like Prometheus and Grafana and Jaeger. So there are answers to these problems, and you don't have to, it's not all or nothing, right? So I think, again, unless you really are going to have like a very big engineering team where you're creating many microservices, like, it's probably not going to be, you're just not going to go to that scale where it's like, oh, I need Istio. Mm-hmm. And without Istio, we fail.
Right. Really interesting. And it's especially interesting because as you were saying that, part of me was like, well, if you're spending the time mucking around with logic, for routing on your load balancers, and you've got specialty DNS, specialized lines of code that deal with DNS lookups, and you've got feature toggles that you're hand coding, and you've got, all the other things, like you're also configuring your application monitoring. That feels like a lot of individual pieces of work. And it would be interesting to me to think about it from that perspective a little bit. Like, yeah, the Istio is this big beast, but it is a centralized beast that kind of probably has a fairly consistent, look and feel when you're playing with it. And if it's replacing a bunch of features that you have to go to umpteen different places to go do on your own, maybe once, it could be sort of like super huge learning curve, but once you've done done it, it's like, whoa, now all of this is so much easier, and I would use it on every project, no matter how small. Could that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you definitely have people that feel that way and do it. It's just, I mean, you can totally decide to go do that investment, right? To go through that learning curve, get really, really good at it. It's a very solid piece of infrastructure that's very, very powerful, right? It's kind of like Kubernetes. I mean, Kubernetes is 3.1 million lines of code. Kubernetes is very, very big, right? It's like, it takes a long time to become an expert in Kubernetes, right? And, so it kind of an interesting point that Elton pointed out during this session is that just these kind of things are kind of like anti-DevOps. So things like Istio and Kubernetes are becoming so complicated that the developers just they're not going to touch it. They don't use it. They don't understand it, right? That's purely for the ops team.
Yeah.
Right. So it's kind of creating that wall again because these tools are becoming so sophisticated and so complicated.
I would fully agree. That's a great point.
And so that's, again, probably another good rule of thumb on whether or not you should be doubling down on these things, right?
Do you have an
do you have an ops team?
Yeah.
Do you want to have an ops team?
Right.
Right. Because that's probably the route you're going down.
Very cool. I think we're going to do the second episode is going to be a bit deeper dive on how some of this works. So yeah, I think that's probably good enough where we've talked about sort of all of what it is from a high level architecture point of view and whether we should use it or not. And then we'll be back next week and talk about this a little more deeply.
All right. Sounds good.
Thanks, Chris.
All right. Thanks, Sean.
Well, dear listener, you made it to the end. We appreciate your time and invite you to continue the conversation with us online. This episode, along with show notes and other valuable resources, is available at mobycast.fm/61. If you have any questions or additional insights, we encourage you to leave us a comment there. Thank you, and we'll see you again next week.